Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. That was the very first one of the Transcendental Etudes by Liszt. There are 12 of them. They are among the hardest pieces in the piano literature. That's just the warm-up. It gets much worse after that, which is why I stop at one. But I think this is a good introduction to Liszt. We'll be talking about him today. He was, many of you know, a concert virtuoso, the very first concert virtuoso. He was the first man to make a living playing the piano solo in public. He was the man who invented this format of opening the piano to the audience. In the older times, in Beethoven's time, for example, the pianist played with his back to the audience. But Liszt was very handsome. He was completely irresistible to the female sex. And they loved sitting in the front row, and they would collect any items of his cigar butts, and they would put them in their bosoms and keep them there all their lives. His hankies, his gloves, which he would throw. He had very long hair. He was the first rock star. And he defined what it meant to be a piano virtuoso. He invented what it means to be a piano virtuoso. So I think when Liszt came into a room, he would sit down and do something like that, what became the very first etude of the Transcendental Etudes. And I want to congratulate Justin, whom I've known since he was 14 years old, basically, with this kooky idea of, hey, let's collect all this East German junk and see where we can put it. I said, where? He said, Los Angeles. You got to be kidding, right? No. And we first opened in Culver City, but on the eastern side of Culver City, in a little kind of business park, and it was by invitation or appointment only to get in to see the stuff. We didn't have much exhibition space, and then somehow, because Justin is a master at this, we finagled the state of California into giving us this building for, what, $1 a year forever or something? 99-year lease. You're in what, this isn't part of it, but the main museum is the old California State Armory here in LA. But in 1985, I went through Charlie for the first time, started a whole new chapter in my life. I flew to Berlin, Tegel, West Berlin, and rented a car, and I drove through up the Friedrichstrasse to Zimmerstrasse, which is where Charlie was, and went through for the first time, and it was a life-changing, literally a life-changing experience. And I had set up a tour of East Germany via the East German embassy because 1985 was the 300th anniversary of the births of Bach and Handel, and they were both from what became East Germany. So I pitched this to Time magazine, and they said, that sounds like a good idea. Here's a plane ticket, go. So I did, and I went through, and I picked up a guy at the press bureau who was to accompany me on the whole trip because they didn't let you wander around all by yourself. And I remember on the phone they said, well, you'll need a translator. And I said, I don't need a translator. We're talking in German, aren't we? And the guy said, yeah, but you'll need a translator. So I got the message. And we went all over East Germany, and among the places we stopped were Weimar and Eisenach, where Bach was born, Halle, where Handel was born. Eventually we got to Leipzig. And in Leipzig is the Thomaskirche, the Church of St. Thomas, where Bach was the cantor for a large part of his creative life. And I walked in the Thomaskirche, and an organist was playing. And I listened, and he finished. And I listened to the resonance of the sound, and I noticed that he had unconsciously or consciously, but probably subconsciously, selected a tempo that would match the decay of the beats of the last chord. And this gave me a moment of Buddhistic enlightenment, I think, which was that all music has its own rhythm, and that when we approach music as a series of signs on a piece of paper with a metronome mark, perhaps to tell you what the tempo is completely wrong. I was having a talk the other day with my old friend James Conlon, who's the music director here at the Los Angeles Opera, and I said, you know, Jim, I think we play romantic music too fast and we play classical music, Mozart, Haydn, too slow. And I think it's because we're not listening to the harmonic rhythm. This comes to Liszt now, because Liszt was the great innovator in harmony. His music moves at the speed at which it's meant to go, and it changes all the time. And to play him metronomically is completely wrong. And we know that as he aged, he quit the concert stage when he was in his 30s and went to become music director in Weimar at the ducal court there, and composed and conducted. We know that as he aged, he moved away from the virtuosic piano stuff, like you just heard, to a more intimate and spiritual and very odd sense of harmony. And a lot of times that music, which comprises the bulk of this program, is looked at as something odd, unplayable. It's very spare. There's not a lot of flashy stuff. It just stops. It'll end on a single note that's tied to another single whole note that has a fermata over it, which means basically let this note sound until infinity. We don't have the patience for that anymore, but we will today, I promise you, because you're going to hear Liszt as I think he's meant to be heard. The thing about him is he taught throughout his life in Weimar, and many of his students left written recordings, written reminiscences of his teaching method. And he taught for free. After he quit the concert stage, he never played for money again in his life. If he played for money, it was always as a benefit for something. For example, the city of Pest, which later merged with Buda and became Budapest late in the 19th century, was flooded by the Danube. And it was a horrible flood, and Liszt, having been born in Hungary but never having spoken Hungarian in his life, and he never did learn Hungarian, rushed to Vienna, which German was his native language, and put on a series of benefit concerts. So he raised a fortune for the people in Pest who had been dislocated by the flood. He raised a fortune to build the monument to Beethoven in Beethoven's city of Bonn, which was the capital of West Germany until Berlin was reunited. So he did a lot of charity work. And to cap it all off, after a career that would make Casanova, Don Giovanni, and Byron blush, he didn't necessarily stop that career, but he decided to become a priest in the Catholic Church. I know, it seems very, very unlikely. He took 4 of the 7 holy orders, by the way, one of which is exorcist. I didn't know that. I'm a born Catholic. I never knew that exorcist was one of the 7 holy orders, but it is. He wore a cassock, he wore a tonsure, and he was referred to as the Abbe, A-B-B-E, Liszt. And the very last piece on the program will be one of his religious pieces, which I think is so weird and strange and wonderful that I have to close with it. So that's a very brief sketch of Liszt, but it was the insight that I got from being in the Thomaskirche about sound and the importance of listening, because we don't listen anymore. A point I wanted to make, we spoke last night at a dinner organized by Karen, and I wanted to make this point then, but I'll make it now. This is not entertainment. Music isn't entertainment. It's not meant to be entertainment. Some of it is. Some of this is Tafel music and music for the royal courts and even Handel's water music. But it's mostly meant to be a philosophical argument without words. And we have, by not teaching the younger generations how to listen to it, we've cut them off from a very important cultural wellspring. And I think it's only now that I'm 70, almost 76. Liszt died when he was 75, so I've got that on him. And last year in Hungary, on his birthday, which is the day before mine, what would have been his 75th birthday, I played a concert in Budapest in his honor. We have to teach our young children how to listen to music, because it's like learning a second language. It's very good to know. I know 2. I know many of you know more than that. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you think of images. You translate images into new sounds. And music is just another language. It's not the universal language, but it has spread all around the world. And the Chinese and the Japanese are very much involved in so-called classical music today. But today we're going to listen to Liszt kind of raw. And the next piece I'm playing are the 5 Hungarian folk songs, which he wrote at the end of his life, but they're very unflashy. They're just Hungarian folk songs. He felt very, very close to Hungary, even though he wasn't an ethnic Hungarian and he didn't speak Hungarian, but he was born in a town that's now in Austria, in eastern Austria, called Riding. And he identified, as he got older, with Hungary. And at the end of his life, he was splitting his time between Weimar, where he had been for so many years, Rome, where he went in his religious capacity, but also as a composer, and Budapest, where they made him the first president of the Royal Hungarian Conservatory of Music. So if you're in Budapest or Weimar or Bayreuth, Germany, where Wagner built his theater, there are Liszt museums all over the place, and I highly recommend them. Once you get a taste for them, you'll see. And so in preparation for this last year, I chased Liszt all over Germany for a month, and I went to the house in Bayreuth, which is located directly across the street from Richard Wagner's big mansion known as Landfried. It was a rooming house, and Liszt went there at the request of his daughter, Cosima, to be the star that attracted people to the Wagner Festival, Wagner having recently died. And Liszt died in that house. He caught terminal pneumonia, and he was quite ill of other ailments, and died in that house. But I was able to go into the room in which he died. And as a writer, screenwriter and novelist and historical writer, I like to be in the places where it happened. I like to listen to the voices. I go to the battlefields for my military history books, and I listen to the men who died there. And it's a very moving spiritual experience if you open yourself up to it. So I hope you will do that today with Liszt, and I'll talk a little bit about each piece as we go. But this is the 5 Hungarian folk songs. So if you asked any musician when did Liszt write that, they would have said probably in the 1830s or 40s, but it's from the late 70s or early, or 1880. He died in 85. He just wanted to set playing Hungarian folk songs. The poems, to 4 of them, are meant to be spoken before each piece. And when we do this in London in November, I'll have, and Budapest as well, I'll have Hungarian speakers reading the poems to the audience. When I was in Budapest last fall, I decided to show off a little bit. I know it's really hard to believe, people who know me, that I would do such a thing, but I thought I would give a little short speech in Hungarian, so I did. But I won't do that today because it was really, let me tell you, Japanese is way, way easier than Hungarian. The next piece is called Chapel of William Tell. It's the very first of the Années de Pèlerinage, the years of pilgrimage. And he wrote 3 volumes of these collections of piano pieces. And they're really meant to be sketches of landscapes and his emotional state. So if you read a book called Vallée d'Obermann by Senancour, which you don't, and no one does anymore, but it was very, very popular among the early Romantics. It was a little bit like Goethe, young Werther. It changed lives, it made young men do things. And it was an exhortation to go into nature and give yourself over to nature and transcend your human body, your humanity in a way to merge with this collective super consciousness. This is the emerging Romantic movement, and Liszt literally, physically embodies it. So I mentioned that Liszt was very fond of women, and women were even fonder of him than he was of them. And at one point he was playing in Paris. The early parts of his career were done in Paris, and he played at a salon. There were lots of salons. Rich women would often have these sorts of gatherings where they could, meet to swap hubbies or find new lovers or whatever it was rich women in Paris did in those days. But in any case, Liszt came and played, and one rich woman, Countess Marie d'Agoult, saw him and basically fell instantly in love with him. She ran off she left her husband and 2 children. She was in her late 20s, and Liszt was in his mid 20s. And they ran away to Geneva, Switzerland. And that started the years of pilgrimage for Liszt. So the first volume is called Switzerland, the second volume is called Italy. And the third volume, you're going to hear 3 of those. It's not called anything at all, but it's really him in Rome, and it's his spiritual transformation. There's a joke in the Blackadder British comedy series, if you've ever seen that. And one of the characters is Captain Flashheart. He's the great Casanova, and one of them is Lieutenant Darling. And everyone makes fun of Lieutenant Darling's last name, of course, because they say, "Hello, darling. Good morning, darling," that sort of thing. You know how the Brits love to use the word darling. Captain Flash is introduced to him, and he says, "Darling, that's a funny name. Last person I called darling was pregnant 20 seconds later." Well, that was true of Countess d'Agoult, too. She was pregnant by the time they left for Switzerland. She had her first baby in Switzerland. Her name was Blondine. And then she had a second baby by Liszt, and her name was Cosima. And a third baby by Liszt, his name was Daniel. Only one of them lived into old age. Both Blondine died in complications of childbirth, and Daniel died of no particular reason. He was a very promising academic, brilliant mind. But Cosima went on to marry Richard Wagner. And Wagner was 2 years younger than Liszt. We'll hear more about Wagner in a bit. Liszt saw the genius in the music and protected him politically when Wagner was being a wanted man for his part in the revolutions of 1849 in Germany. And naturally, of course, Cosima was already inconveniently married to somebody else, one of Liszt's students, but she too decided to be just like dear old dad, and she ran off with Wagner and had 3 of his children while she was still married to the first husband. So this is the sexual milieu in which these people are flourishing. It seems a little bit like the Bloomsbury Group in London. It certainly was the thing to do and be in 19th century Central Europe. So this piece is the Chapel of William Tell. It's a chapel, it's still there, it's been rebuilt several times. It's on the shores of the lake. Lake Geneva, you may know, has a place in literary history as the location of the Villa Diodati. which was the home to Byron Shelley and Mary Shelley, was the teenage girl, Mary Goodwin, and a couple of other people. And because a volcano had exploded in the South Pacific, there was no summer that year in Europe, so they were all stuck inside in the rain. And they wrote Frankenstein and what became Dracula. So the lake around Geneva is a very historic place in both musical history and literary history. So anyway, this is the story of William Tell. You know the William Tell story. He refuses to doff his cap to Gessler's hat, and he's arrested, and his punishment is to shoot an arrow off an apple with an arrow off the head of his son. And this he does. And the second half of the story is what Liszt is illustrating here, which is that he goes on to lead the Swiss Helvetians. That's why the logo for Switzerland is CH, Confederatio Helvetii, and he leads them in the revolt against the Austrians. So you'll hear all of that. You hear the trumpet calls, the calls to war, the religious part of the feeling, which will come at the beginning and at the end. And it's just a spectacular movie, basically, and you can follow it. Yes, I am playing in my socks, just in case you hadn't noticed, because I believe in being comfortable at the keyboard. And so I feel the pedals better that way than through shoes, and it's just it helps command the instrument better. So that's the Chapel of William Tell. It sets off this long chain of pieces called the Année de Pèlerinage. So at this point, at sort of the end of the first part of this performance, we're going to listen to a piece that's never played, never. Not because it's bad, it's just because we don't associate piano music with Wagner. We associate Tristan and Isolde, we associate the Ring Cycle, we associate Parsifal, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, all of the great operas that Wagner wrote in the 1850s, 60s, that really changed the course of musical history. But this gets me to a very important point, which is the political point, not in reference to any contemporary politics, but to 19th century politics, which is music was one of the driving philosophical forces behind political change in Europe. There would be no revolution of 1849 were it not for Goethe, Senancour, whose work I mentioned, Liszt, Chopin coming to Paris, becoming friends with Liszt, falling in love with Georges Sand, the French female author. Liszt, meanwhile, with his own mistress, Countess d'Agoult. The whole circle that arose around what was then called the music of the future. We were not going to go back to Beethoven. We're going to build on Beethoven, but we're going to go in a different direction, harmonically, pianistically, virtuosically, in any way possible. And so it's not surprising. It would be today, but it's not surprising in the 19th century we find people like Wagner, who was also an inveterate pamphleteer, wrote many things, some of them quite regrettable, politically and socially. But the man is who the man is, and we have to accept them with their warts and flaws and all. But Wagner was a dedicated political revolutionary. Now, I must point out that neither Liszt nor Wagner turned down royal support, ever. They really liked nice clothes. Wagner was always dressed extremely well, extremely comfortably, never had a dime, but he lived like a king. Until he was, in fact, kind of financially adopted by Ludwig, the King of Bavaria. Liszt, as I said, did everything for charity and traveled very frugally himself. He always traveled third class. When the railroads came in, he traveled third class, and he didn't ask for anything special. If you see the beds he slept in both Budapest and in the room where he died, it's just a simple single bed. There wasn't room for anybody but him in it. He has a prière-dieu, this place to kneel and pray with a crucifix on it that devout Catholics sometimes still have in their homes. So he's consumed by the spiritual, the almighty, and God, and the things of the flesh. So naturally, Wagner falls for his daughter. She has 3 children with Wagner before she finally divorces her husband, who was a Liszt pupil, and she runs off with Wagner. And together, they create the Ring Cycle and Parsifal. And so if you go to Bayreuth today and you see the theater, which I've been to many times, up on the Green Hill, and you go inside, it is magical. It's one of the greatest musical experiences in the world to see Das Rheingold there, the opening E-flat chord, so low that you can't hear it and the room is completely black. It's a Greek theater, amphitheater shape that Wagner designed, with everything black. You can't see a thing. The orchestra's under the stage, and there's a cowl over it, so you can't see the orchestra either. So all of a sudden, the sound emerges like magic. And you are in for the next 19 hours, basically, all 4 operas, because he's done that just with this one trick. So the history behind this sonata is, of course, he wrote it for a girl. He wrote it for Mathilde von Wesendonck, who was conveniently the wife of one of his patrons, and who was sheltering him from political persecution in Germany at their home in Switzerland. And they were relatively newlyweds. She was very beautiful. In the house, the Wagner house in Bayreuth, in Bonfrey, this whole room dedicated to her, and you can see many portraits of her. She was quite strikingly beautiful. And of course, Wagner fell in love with her immediately and pushed the relationship. We're not quite sure how far. It was certainly far enough for the husband to find out about it and throw him out. But he never stopped supporting Wagner's music. Financially, he continued to underwrite him. He just didn't want him fooling around with his wife in the little house next door. Some guys are just unreasonable. I don't understand. So this sonata, Wagner wrote for Matilda, Wesendonck. He also wrote a series of songs called the Wesendonck Lieder. There's 5 or 6 of them. But this piece, because Wagner's not a great writer for the piano, wasn't a pianist himself, that he left that job to his father-in-law, Liszt, who was only 2 years older than him. It's a lovely piece, and I think you'll like it. If you know Wagner, you'll hear Tannhäuser in it, and mostly you'll hear Tristan. Because at this point, Wagner is madly in love with Matilda, and he's writing the poem and the music to Tristan, which is about a couple who are literally madly in love with each other. And it is the most erotic opera ever written. The music is harmonically the most adventurous up to its time. The resolutions are delayed and delayed and delayed until this final orgasmic Liebestod at the end, where Tristan is, of course, dead, because that's what happens in Wagner operas, and she dies over his body, but completes this cycle of eroticism that's been going on in the music from the very beginning. So you're going to hear a little bit of that in this. Wagner, like most composers, they anticipate what they're going to do and they build on what they've already done, so you get this melange of styles and influences. Anyway, this is sonata in A flat. It's about 15 minutes long. It's very simple in structure. It starts with a slow section. There's a little faster middle section in the center, which really will remind you of Tristan, what's coming with Tristan. And it concludes with a reprise of the opening, but with lots of different key changes, and I hope you enjoy it. If I had one of my girl singers, we'd do Somewhere Over the Rainbow for you just to memorialize the sheer MGM-ness of this place. So the second half of the concert is all of late Liszt. Most of these pieces written in the 1880s, where he was ill. He took a terrible fall in 1881 down the stairs at the place he was living in Weimar. It was built for the royal gardener of the park on which this house sits. It's called the Gärtnerei. Anyway, he fell down the stairs and badly injured himself, but he never wanted to go to a doctor or see medical attention. It's kind of a male thing, and he gradually recovered, but he was never quite the same after that. He had cataracts and began to go blind, and cataract surgery had just been invented, believe it or not. This is 1885. And he was supposed to go to the world's leading and only, I suppose, cataract surgeon in Dresden or someplace like that, somewhere in East Germany. But he never made it because he died in late July of 1885. But the fall down the stairs really changed him, as it changes all of us with age and infirmity. And so he devoted himself in the third book of the Année de Pèlerinage to these spiritual pieces. The first one we're going to hear is called Angelus, Prayer to the Guardian Angels. And Liszt spent, as I mentioned, a lot of time in Italy. He lived at the Villa d'Este, which was the residence of Cardinal Hohenlohe, a German cardinal very influential in the Vatican. It's about 20 miles east of Rome, famous for its cypress trees and its fountains. So he would go there as the guest of Cardinal Hohenlohe and mostly compose. I mentioned that he had a mistress, Countess Marie d'Agoult. Well, the reason he ended his concert career is he got another mistress, always cherchez la femme, and her name was Caroline Sine-Wittgenstein, and she was married into the Sine-Wittgenstein family. She was Polish, Catholic, married this Russian nobleman, and she encountered Liszt in St. Petersburg, and just as Marie d'Agoult had fallen for him, so Caroline fell for him. She was not beautiful, which always surprises people. She was rather homely, actually, especially compared to Marie. But she had one great virtue, which was she was immensely wealthy. So that buys a lot of beer goggles, I suppose. In any case, she lost a lot of that money because mostly they were lands in the Ukraine. All the Russian royalty had lands in the Ukraine as for their country estates. And after she abandoned her husband and eventually was divorced from him in the Russian Orthodox Church, she moved in with Liszt at Weimar at a big house called I've forgotten, it'll come back to me in a bit, a big house that she rented, and he held his salons there and he taught there, and this was earlier in his stay in Weimar. Anyway, she directed him, bossed him around really, in the direction of spirituality and Catholicism, which he had been born into, and of course had always expressed an interest in, and had talked about becoming a priest when he was a young teenager, and then he discovered girls, and that was the end of becoming a priest, temporarily anyway. And so he started looking internally. He and Caroline were going to get married. The Pope had approved an annulment, a Catholic divorce, and they were going to get married on Liszt's birthday in 1861. And at the last minute, there were complications. Somebody paid somebody to do something, and the Pope, who was a friend of Liszt, withdrew the annulment for further study, and that ended any prospect of their marrying. And in fact, they sort of split at that point, and he began to take up a solitary life in Rome and in Budapest and also back in Weimar. So this first piece, Angelus, Prayer to Guardian Angels, is the first piece of Book 3 of the Année de Pèlerinage. It was written for Liszt's granddaughter, Daniela, who was named after his late son, Daniel. He was inspired by the bells. If you've been to Italy, you know there's bells. There's cypress trees and bells and pizza and yummy food. Really pretty girls and lots of very attractive things. But the bells are very distinctive. And he was amused by how they ring off beat as they're tolling the Angelus. This is a time when Europe is almost 100% Catholic, a very, very strong Catholic countries, Bavaria, not the Protestant countries in the north, but in the south. So you'd hear the bells ringing, the various services throughout the Catholic day. So this is the Angelus, Prayers of the Guardian Angels, written for his 10-year-old or so granddaughter, Daniela. I mentioned the famous cypress trees of the Villa d'Este outside of Rome. Liszt wrote two pieces about them in a very downcast mood. His changed physical health and fortunes did influence his music. With most composers, that's not true. Tchaikovsky was sad, so he wrote sad music. Mozart was happy, so he wrote happy. That's not true. Their works of art exist independently of one's emotional state, although one's emotional state often fuels them. But in this case, Liszt was so taken by the way you hear it in the music, the cypresses sway. If you've seen those big tall cypress trees, you know when the wind comes by, they'll just go like this. And so this is his portrait. I love that piece. I've only just learned it in the last few months, and it's something really rewarding to play, and it's better when you play the right notes, but I got most of them, so you get the main idea. This is, I should note, it's the first time I've played in public for 40-some years. I played a lot as a student at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. I liked to accompany singers. I did a lot of shows with singers, American popular music from the late 1890s and early Tin Pan Alley stuff. I am a devotee of Scott Joplin, and when I was originally thinking about this program, especially for London and for European audiences, to put one of the great Joplin rags, the Gladiolus rag, on the program, but we'll maybe do that in another life. The next piece is the Mephisto Waltz number 4. When we get to the end of his life, sometimes he doesn't finish the piece, he just leaves it, or it just trails off in a way like you heard the cypresses at the end of that, swaying, slightly changing color, and then just dying away as those trees do when the wind stops blowing. The next one is Mephisto Waltz number 4. Liszt wrote 4 Mephisto Waltzes. The first one is very, very famous. It's also impossible. Really great pianists play it. And then 2, 3, and 4 are somewhat more approachable. 4 he left unfinished. So, because he and I are like this, I decided to finish it for him. So the ending will be my interpretation of the sketches that he left in the harmonic direction in which I think the piece is going, kind of turns into the Valse oubliée number 1, and then I put a showy ending on it just for the sheer hell of it. So here we go. Thank you. So I hope the old boy would have liked that ending that I put on it, because otherwise it just kind of stops. So the last piece on the program is Sursum Corda, Lift Up Your Hearts, the line from the Mass, from the real Mass, the one in Latin. We don't go with this English stuff here among conservative Catholics. So you think it's going to be joyous hallelujah, kumbaya, you'd be wrong. The last piece of the Année de Pèlerinage, lift up your hearts. And I think what I want you to take away from this moment is the passion, the anger, and the spirituality of it. I've noted about Mozart that there's a lot of anger in Mozart. It's almost never played that way. It's always played as happy, silly little Rococo China doll music, but it's filled, it seethes with anger. And most romantic music does. So, well, will that list speak for himself?
very much. It's so nice to have you all here. I'm very, very grateful to Karen for setting this up, to Justin, of course, for allowing us into his brilliant museum, and I hope you all take advantage of coming here. You should see parking is easy, so that's a real plus in Los Angeles. And the exhibitions will have gone from what was really basically East German collection. And I said to Justin when we first met, you know, I think I actually used that telephone in East Berlin and was standing behind the Stasi barrier watching them input their information into their little coding machines. And the end of the story of when I went to Berlin for the first time through Charlie and I met my friend Victor Homola, we become lifelong friends. So at some point during our journey together, we realized that we both were young fathers, we had new daughters, and while we were on opposite sides of the political divide, our common humanity brought us together. And today, we're still best friends. In fact, we had a Cold War reunion a couple of years ago in Berlin, and I made the same toast to the ex-Stasi and ex-KGB agents that I know, which is, you lost, you're buying the beer. Thank you very much for